Thank you. You may be seated, and welcome all of you from the classic service to the Sioux campus, our online campus, our TV audience, our radio audience. We're glad to have all of you watching from wherever you're watching from, however you're watching. It's great to have you with us. We have a focus that we're focusing on this year, next year, and the year after. 6 areas of focus that we would love to see everyone who's part of our church grow in their walk of faith in. And one of those areas is prayer, talking to God. And so we've put together a 40-day renew challenge to help all of us focus on prayer. And for 40 days, beginning March 6th and going through Easter, you can get a short devotional written by someone in our church. I write the first of each week's. Other people in our church write the others. And every day, they're designed to help you focus on renewing your prayer life leading up to Easter. It's going to be a wonderful thing for all of us to do. So no matter what campus you're part of, online, TV, radio, doesn't matter. We'd love for you to be part. Now, to be part, it's real simple. You just have to take out your phone, and you can feel free to do that now, and you're going to text the word RENEW, R-E-N-E-W, to this number, 989-623-4779, 989-623-4779. Text the word RENEW. I did it this morning to make sure it works. It does. In a few minutes, you'll get a response with a link. You follow that link, you'll just put in your name and your email address. That's all there is to it. That way, beginning March 6th, for 40 consecutive days, you'll get a short devotional, again, written by someone who's part of our church, to help us renew our focus on prayer. So I'm going to encourage all of you to participate. Again, you just take your phone, text the word RENEW to 989-623-4779, then follow that link, give your name, give your email address. You'll be all set to go. You'll get your first devotional via email on March 6th. Then you'll get one every day for 40 days leading up to Easter. Well, this morning, as we move in our study through the life of Abraham into Genesis chapter 18, I want to start by asking you 3 questions. Now, I don't want you to answer out loud, just answer in your heart, but here are the 3 questions. Ready? Number 1, have you ever laughed at God? Have you ever laughed at God? Something you saw in Scripture, or maybe a prompting that He gave you, and you just couldn't help but laugh. Question number 2. Have you ever lied to God? Number 1, have you ever laughed at God? Number 2, have you ever lied to God? And question number 3, have you ever negotiated with God? Have you ever gotten into a negotiation with Him? God, I'll do this if you'll do this. Now, with that said, if the answer is yes to any of those 3 questions, I'd like you to raise your hand at all of our campuses, hit the like button online. Yes, pretty much all of us have probably either at some point lied to God, laughed at God, or negotiated with God. Well, today Abraham and Sarah they're gonna do the hat trick. They're gonna do all 3. Sarah's gonna laugh at God, then Sarah's gonna lie to God, then Abraham's gonna try to negotiate with God. It's a pretty interesting story. So as we begin in Genesis 18, I want to start in verse number 1. Now, as I do, let me just kind of give you a preface, and the preface is this. This chapter begins with Sarah inside the tent, doing whatever she's doing. Abraham is sitting outside under the trees in the shade. And 3 visitors are going to show up. Now, it almost appears from the text that they come out of nowhere. And I'm going to suggest to you right up front, and I'll show you why as we go through the text, that these visitors, though they are in human form, aren't humans. I believe 2 of them are angels. Now, why do I say that? Well, because at the end of the chapter, in verse number 22, as we get towards the end, in verse 22, those 2 are going to go on to Sodom, the city of Sodom, and in chapter 19, we discover that those 2 are angels. So I believe 2 of them are angels. But I believe the 3rd visitor is more than an angel. I believe the third visitor is the second person of the Trinity himself, Jesus Christ, God the Son. Now, we've seen this before in our study. Remember, Jesus didn't begin at Bethlehem. That's when God became flesh. But the second person of the Trinity has always existed. He's eternal, always existed as part of the Godhead. And there are times we see Jesus making an appearance in the Old Testament. We call those Christophanies. I believe that the one who's speaking in this passage is Jesus himself. And I'll show you why as we read. So with that in mind, let me start with verse number 1. And it says, "Now the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre while he was sitting at the tent door in the heat of the day." Who appeared to him? The Lord. So as these visitors come, the Lord is appearing to him. Now, by the way, that name, the Lord there, is the same name that God is going to give Moses when he reveals himself to Moses. This is God. I believe this is Jesus himself. Now the Lord appeared. Verse number 2. "When Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, behold, 3 men were standing opposite him." It's almost like they appeared out of nowhere. "And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door," that's where he was sitting in the shade, "to meet them. And he bowed to the earth," which, by the way, was the custom of the day. That in our culture, that's our culture's fist bump, right? It used to be a handshake, now it's a fist bump. He kind of went out to greet them. "And he said to them, 'My Lord,'" now that's a different name for Lord. That's a more common name that you would use out of respect. I don't think at this point Abraham knows who these visitors are. "Now, Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, please do not pass your servant by. Instead, please let a little water be brought out. You can wash your feet. You can rest under the tree in the shade. And I'll bring each of you a piece of bread so you can refresh yourselves. After that, you can go on, since you have visited your servant." And they said, "So do as you have said." So here's Abraham. He's being a nice guy here. He's showing some hospitality. He's saying, "Guys, why don't you just sit down in the shade. It's hot. Tell you what, I'll go get some water so you can wash your feet, and I'll get you each a piece of bread. You're probably hungry." Now notice what Abraham does next. It makes me chuckle. Because I realize that though hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years have passed and culture has changed, husbands have not. Look at this. "So Abraham," verse 6, "hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, 'Quickly, prepare 3 measures of fine flour, knead it, and make some bread.'" Just like a husband, makes a commitment without telling his wife, and who's got to fulfill the commitment? His wife, right? And she's not just going to the bread box, pulling out a stale dinner roll. She's got to make it from scratch. She's got to knead it. She's got to do all of that. Amazing what Abraham does. But he doesn't stop there. It says in verse 7, "Abraham also ran to the herd. He took a tender and choice calf," not a mature cow, a calf, "and gave it to the servant and said, 'Hurry and prepare it.'" So he's gone from, "Hey, have a seat, guys. I'll get you a little water for your feet and a piece of bread," to homemade bread and veal cutlet. Okay, that's what he's turned into now. So get this calf, let's slaughter it, let's prepare this meat. He is going all out. And then it says, in verse number 8, "He took curds and milk and the calf which he had prepared and placed it before them, and he was standing by them under the tree as they ate." Now, folks, this was a pretty lengthy process, right? How long does it take to make bread from scratch? How long does it take to butcher a calf and make veal cutlets, right? So this is a long process that he goes all through. And again, at this point, we don't know, does he know who this is or not? Well, keep in mind that the type of hospitality he's showing is not something that would be uncommon in that day. Because in that day, hospitality was seen as a virtue and an honor. When you had the opportunity to show hospitality, it was an honor to do so. Now I have to pause. And here's why. Because some of you might be thinking, you know what? I like being hospitable. That's a cool thing to do. I enjoy that. I need you to understand that our definition of hospitality today is far different than the Bible's definition. You see, in our day, what's hospitality? It's having people over, right? It's being a house guest, bring them over, I'll fix them something to eat, we'll have a dinner party. That's how we see hospitality. Now, let me ask you 2 questions. Number 1, when you show hospitality today, when you invite someone over to your house for dinner, do you usually invite someone you know or someone who's a stranger? Who do you usually invite? Someone you know. That's exactly right. Let me ask you a different way. Maybe today you're having a Super Bowl party and you've invited some people over to your house for a Super Bowl party. Question, who did you invite? People you like and enjoy being around, or people who grind your gourd? Who did you invite? People you like, people you enjoy. Folks, that's not biblical hospitality. We might in our culture today call that fellowship. That's not hospitality. The word hospitality, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, always denotes showing kindness to a stranger. That's biblical hospitality. By the way, hospitality is seen in the New Testament as even a qualification to be a spiritual leader in the church. It has to do with strangers. Now remember, back in the Old Testament times, there weren't Motel 6s and Holiday Inns on every corner. So when people came through town traveling, they had nowhere to stay, and they would rely on the hospitality of people who would take them into their home, though they were strangers, feed them, let them sleep there, and then send them on their way with enough food to get them started in the morning. It wasn't just common, it was essential. Now, you might be thinking, I'm not real sure. I just want to bring Joe Stranger into my home in the times in which we live. I get that. But can I bring it down to an example I think we can all relate to? Here's my guess. And I've talked about this before. My guess is that when you come to church on Sunday morning, all of your real conversations, I'm not talking about, hey, how you doing? I'm talking about your real conversations would be classified as fellowship. You know why? Because the only people you have real conversations with at church are people you what? Know. When's the last time you had a real conversation at church with somebody you didn't know? That's hospitality. I've often said, if I were God, that would be the 11th commandment. At church, thou shalt not talk to anybody you know until you first talk to somebody you don't know. That's hospitality. Folks, you can show biblical hospitality before you leave church today. How? Have a real conversation with somebody you don't know. If you're watching online, that's what we have the comment section for on Facebook and on our online portal. You can begin to make comments. You can reply to other people's comments. You say, I don't know them. That's okay. That's biblical hospitality. And that's what Abraham does. He shows hospitality. Now, as we get to verse number 9, they've eaten, okay? Abraham's standing next to them. Sarah's still in the tent, right? She's probably cleaning up. Now, here's what it says in verse number 9. Then they, those heavenly visitors, said to Abraham, where is Sarah, your wife? Now we realize the purpose for their visit. If you remember at the end of chapter 17, God told Abraham, this time next year, Sarah will have a son. Everything I promised you for the last 24 years, it's going to happen next year. So this obviously happened shortly after that because these visitors are going to give the same timeline. Now, they've come to make sure Sarah knows the timeline. Now, I don't know if that means Abraham didn't tell her, because he's like, every time I tell her, she goes, yeah, right. Or maybe Abraham said, God, do you think you could go tell her? I don't know. But they come with one purpose, and that's to make sure Sarah knows that she, though she's 90 years old, is going to have a baby in 1 year. So let's keep reading. They said, where's Sarah, your wife? He said, in the tent. The Lord, the he in verse 10, we'll go back to the Lord in verse 1, said, I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. This time next year. Now, the end of the verse says this. And Sarah was listening at the tent door. What's Sarah doing? What every godly wife would be doing, eavesdropping. She's eavesdropping on the conversation. She's curious. She's listening. As she hears this visitor say, this time next year, Sarah, your 90-year-old wife, is going to have a baby. Verse 12. How does Sarah respond? And by the way, verse 11 reminds us Abraham and Sarah were not just old, they were advanced in years. Some people are old, some people are advanced in years. And Sarah was past childbearing. Okay? She'd already gone through the change of life. She had no ability to do this. So when Sarah hears this eavesdropping, and Sarah doesn't want them to know she's eavesdropping, Sarah is practicing the spiritual gift of sneakiness. She's just listening. And Sarah laughed, but how did she laugh? Don't miss it. This is important. She laughed to herself. She didn't laugh out loud. That wasn't that. She laughed inwardly. Now, those visitors and Abraham are outside. They cannot see her. They cannot hear her. She laughs inwardly. Have you ever done that? Just this week, I was having a conversation with someone, and this person said something so foolish, I'll just say, so stupid, that everything in me wanted to bust out laughing. But he was looking at me. I couldn't. So I kept the poker face on because I didn't want to offend him. I'd rather talk about his behind his back now. I kept the poker face on, but inside I was busting the gut laughing. I couldn't believe he said it. That's what Sarah's doing. And not only does she laugh inwardly, she speaks to herself inwardly, not out loud, but inwardly. And what does she say? After I become old, shall I have the pleasure of motherhood? My Lord being old also? Oh, by the way, who's she referring to? What does she call him? That's nice. By the way, Peter will remind believers in 1 Peter 3 that Sarah called Abraham Lord. But we're not studying 1 Peter 3 right now, so let's just keep going. We'll do that when I'm old and advanced in age. Okay, here we go. It says this. And so Sarah laughed to herself, and verse 13, and the Lord said to Abraham, now remember, Sarah's in the tent. They can't see her. She doesn't do anything out loud. And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah just laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child when I'm old? Doesn't that help you identify who this person is? Could this person see Sarah? No, she was in the tent. She didn't say anything out loud. How does this person know that she laughed to herself? How does she know how does this person know what she said to herself? Because this person is the second person of the Godhead. He is omniscient. He knew what Sarah was doing in the tent by herself. He knew she was eavesdropping. He knew that she laughed to herself. He knows what she's thinking. He knew what she said, even though she didn't say it out loud. By the way, can I just remind you that God knows those things about you too? God knows what you do when no one else is in the room. God knows what you are feeling and thinking internally. God knows what you're thinking, even though you've never said it. And so he asks, why did Sarah just laugh? And then he gives this rhetorical question. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? Of course, what's the answer to that? I hope you know the answer to that. No. By the way, that word difficult, it's also translated in the Old Testament wonderful or beautiful. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord to do? Is anything too beautiful for the Lord to do? By the way, remember when the angel visits Mary and tells Mary she's going to have a baby? And Mary says, I believe it, but how's it going to happen since I've never known a man? And the angel says, well, your relative Elizabeth, though she's barren and old, she's pregnant right now with a child because nothing is impossible for the Lord. Now, look what happens next. He says in verse 14, is anything too difficult for the Lord? At the appointed time, don't miss that, I will return to you this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. When will it happen? At the appointed time. Folks, God is in control of history, past, present, and future. God made this promise 24 years earlier. Why didn't it happen in year 1? Because it wasn't the appointed time. Why didn't it happen in year 2? Because it wasn't the appointed time. Why didn't it happen in year 3, 4, 5, all the way through year 24? Because it wasn't the appointed time. But next year will be the appointed time. You see, God always keeps his promises, but not a moment too soon and not a moment too late. He's never a moment too early. He's never a moment too late. It's always the appointed time. That's what we learn in Galatians 4 about the birth of Jesus. After hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of waiting for the promised Messiah, the Bible says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son. Not a moment too early, not a moment too late. God controls history. Now, verse 15, I find also humorous. Because it says, now where's Sarah? She's in the tent. She's been eavesdropping. She now hears that, this visitor knew I laughed. So what does she do? She denied it, saying, I did not laugh. Now, here's what I don't know. I just kind of picture this. I'm not so sure Sarah ever came out of the tent. They're out there talking, and they just hear Sarah go, wasn't me. I didn't laugh. I love what God does. God ends the conversation. And when God ends the conversation, folks, the conversation's over. And he just says, yes, you did. Yes, you did. Now, as we go to verse number 16, it's almost like we go to a different scene. These 3 heavenly visitors are starting to leave. Abraham is escorting them a little bit of the way. We know there will come a time when the 2 angels will go on to Sodom. We see that in verse 22, and it will just be, and verse 22 says specifically, it'll just be Abraham and the Lord talking in verse 22. So notice what happens, though. Let me start reading in verse number 16. Then the men, the Lord and the angels, rose up from there. They looked down towards Sodom. Abraham was walking with them to send them off. My guess is at this point, Abraham knows who they are. He gets it. It's the same message that God gave him in the last chapter. He saw the omniscience. I think he at this point knows who he's talking to. And the Lord said, and I'm going to guess he's saying to these angels, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations will be blessed. For I've chosen him so he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he's spoken. I think I'm going to let him in. I think I'm going to let Abraham in on what's going on. So here's what he says, verse 20. And the Lord said, speaking to Abraham, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, and their sin is exceedingly grave. Now, we already knew that, didn't we? We learned that back a few chapters when Lot first went that direction. This was an incredible, evil city. It says that the outcry of the evil has reached the ears of God. Who's doing the outcry? Well, maybe it's Lot. We learn from Peter in the New Testament that Lot was very bothered by the sin of the city. But chances are really good the outcry is coming up from the victims of the crimes. Remember back in Genesis when God said to Cain after Cain killed Abel, the blood of your brother Abel cries out to me? I believe that the cries coming out are the cries of the victims in this city. And so, God says this, verse 21, I will go down now and see if they have done entirely according to the outcry which has come to me. And if not, I'll know. Now, let me give you a couple principles before we see a negotiation that takes place. Principle number one is this. While sin may be ignored by others, it is never overlooked by God. Would you please note that? Though sin may be ignored by others, it's never overlooked by God. The people of Sodom overlooked their own sin. It had gotten to a point that you and I have never seen in our culture. You might say, well, we're living in the worst culture ever. No, we're not. No, we're not, folks. You'll see that next week. When we hit chapter 19 next week, folks, can I just tell you, it's going to be intense. Come prayed up next week. Come prayed up. It's intense. Do you want to know how wicked they were? Even the pagan nations around them who practiced temple prostitution and offering their children as sacrifices to their idols, they viewed Sodom as evil. Now, folks, when people who kill their own children under the banner of religion see you as evil for what you do, you're pretty bad. God doesn't overlook it. Folks, that's important. Because one thing we have done in our culture today is we've gotten very good at ignoring our own sin. We've done that as individuals. We've done that as a nation. And though you may think you're ignoring your own sin, God never overlooks sin. The Bible would teach us that God is just. We know he's holy. That means he can't have a relationship with sin, but he's just. You know what that means? That means that God must punish sin. He must. If God did not punish sin, he would not be God. Some believers make the mistake of thinking, whoa, because I accepted Jesus, my sin doesn't get punished. Yes, your sin got punished. It was Jesus who took the punishment for you. God is just. He cannot overlook sin. If he overlooked sin, he would not be God. Though you and I may ignore sin in our life, God never overlooks sin. He is just. Now, the Hebrew text in this passage literally says, I will go down and see if their sin is made complete. What's that mean? Well, folks, listen. Not only is God just, he will punish sin, God is also patient. What's that mean? That means he has a long fuse. That means though he will punish sin, he waits a long time before he does. You know why he waits? Peter tells us very clearly in the New Testament, the reason God is patient is to give more time for people to repent, to give more time for people to turn to him. So on one hand, he is just. He must punish sin. But on the other hand, he's patient. He waits until their sin is complete. It's almost like the sin is being viewed like a cup that's being filled up. And once that cup of sin reaches the brim, then God says, no more waiting. I've been patient, but now I must judge sin. And that's what God is saying to Abraham. Abraham, I think the sin of Sodom has reached that point. The cup is full. I've given them a long time hoping they'd repent, but they haven't. Now I must judge them. Now, beginning in verse number 22, a dialogue takes place between Abraham and God. And here's why. Because Abraham has one thought go through his mind. My nephew lives in Sodom with his wife, with his daughters, with their fiancés. If God wipes out the city, they'll die. So now Abraham goes into a little bit of a negotiation with God. We won't read it. You can read it on your own. But basically it goes like this. Abraham says, God, I understand. But will you also kill the righteous because you're judging the city? Because you're judging their sin? And Abraham says, God, what if, God, what if there were 50 righteous people in the city? Would you spare the city? Would you delay your judgment for those 50 righteous people? And God says, yeah, I do that, Abraham. And that's when Abraham goes, I don't think I set the bar low enough because I doubt there's 50 righteous people in that city. He says, God, what about 45? God says, okay, for 45 righteous people, I'll delay judgment. Abraham says, what about 40? Okay. 30? Sure. 20? All right, for 20 righteous people. And then Abraham says, God, I hope you're not going to get mad at me, but can I just, how about 10? What if there's only 10? And God says, okay, Abraham, for the sake of 10 people, I'll delay judgment. Now, why does Abraham stop at 10? Well, he's probably doing the math in his head. He's going, okay, there's Lot, his wife, 2 daughters. They each have fiancés. And you know, Lot's lived in that city for like 2 decades. Surely he's influenced 4 others. There's got to be 10. You know, we'll find out next week. There wasn't even 5. Only 4 will escape the city. And even one of them will die along the way. It's an amazing dialogue. It's an amazing negotiation. By the way, it's a beautiful picture of what we call today intercession. What's intercession? Intercession is when you go to someone greater than yourself on behalf of somebody else. Abraham went to God on behalf of who? Lot and his family. In the New Testament, we are taught that we have the privilege as believers to come before our great God on behalf of others. And Abraham is a beautiful example that God is moved by the prayer of the intercessor. Well, let me just end with 3 principles I see from this dialogue. 3 principles. Principle number 1. God judges sin, both individually and nationally. That's very clear from this passage, is it not? God doesn't overlook it. He will judge sin. It may not happen today, it may not happen tomorrow. He's patient, but he will judge sin. He will judge sin in an individual's lives. He will judge sin in the life of a nation. And there are plenty of examples throughout history to show that. There's a second principle, and it's this. There are times that God may delay his judgment when there is a righteous influence. Do you see that in the text? God was willing to delay his judgment for the sake of a righteous influence. Now, why is that important? Here's why. Listen. You may be the only obedient follower of Jesus in your home, and that's hard. But never underestimate the impact you're having. You may be the only obedient follower of Jesus where you work, and that's hard. But never underestimate the impact you're having. You may be the only obedient follower of Jesus in your neighborhood, at your school, on your team, in your club. That's hard, but never underestimate the impact you're having. Then there's a final principle, and it's this. It appears in this passage that God may at times delay his judgment when people pray. That's what Abraham did. He prayed, and God was willing to delay his judgment. That's why we want to do this 40-day focus on prayer, because prayer does matter. You see, I think this is important. So I'm going to say this, and please understand, it's not a political statement, though I think there's probably some who will take it that way. It's not. But today I fear that what has happened in the church is we have somehow come to believe that the number one way we can change our culture is through protests. And I'm not saying protests are always wrong, not saying that. But I fear that as a church, and I'm using that big C, the whole church, nationwide, we have come to the conclusion that the best way we can change our culture and renew righteousness is to protest. Ladies and gentlemen, the best way, the most effective way that we can change our culture is to pray. Show me one time in the Bible where protesting got it done. Remember 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14? You all know it. If my people who are called by my name will rise up and protest. No. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then in response to their prayers, then I will hear from heaven. Then I will forgive their sin. Then I will heal their land. The number one way we'll change culture is to pray. Because as James said, the effective, fervent prayer of a righteous person accomplishes much. Would you stand with me, please, for prayer? Father, what a story. What a story. I'm thankful. I'm thankful that when it comes to other believers and people around me, that you have given me the privilege of intercession, being able to come before you on behalf of them, like Abraham did for Lot. And God, I'm thankful that as we see our culture decaying, as we see evil expanding, that you have given us a tool, a weapon that accomplishes much, because nothing is impossible with God. And that weapon, that tool, is prayer. I pray, God, that we would become, as a church, as individuals, more committed to prayer. What a friend we have in Jesus. All our griefs and sins to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Amen.